Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. We are delighted to be joined today by two friends of AJC, Senator Norm Coleman, the National Chairman of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and Mark Mellman, renowned political strategist, pollster, and President and CEO of the Democratic Majority for Israel, for an analysis and discussion on the US presidential election. Moderating today's conversation is Jason Isaacson, AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. As a reminder, AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization. As such, AJC does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. After we hear from Jason and our guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. And Jason, with that, you and our guests have the floor.
Jillian, thank you very much. And thank you all for participating in today's important discussion. After a long and difficult campaign against the background of the worst pandemic in a century and the steepest job loss since the Great Depression, the 2020 election is over, almost.
Yeah.
There will still be legal wrangling over specific states' mailed-in ballots and counting procedures, and we cannot today say with certainty who has won the presidency. But we can certainly assess what we know about the likelihood that President Trump or Vice President Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2021, about the impact of that America's choice will have on issues of concern to the Jewish community, about the role of Jews in the respective presidential campaigns and in congressional races, and about the American political atmosphere going forward and how hospitable it's likely to be for Jews and other minorities. We're fortunate to be guided in this assessment by two veteran political actors and observers and longtime friends of the American Jewish Committee, Senator Norm Coleman of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and political strategist Mark Mellman of the Mellman Group, as well as the Democratic Majority for Israel. I'm going to pose a few questions to our speakers, and then I will open the discussion to questions from you, the viewers, questions that you can submit by emailing questions@ajc.org. First, I'd like to welcome Senator Coleman and Mark Mellman to today's discussion. Thank you both for appearing again before AJC.
Jason, thank you. And let me just say something up front, Jason, before we get started. It's easy to be a longtime friend of the AJC if you care about Israel, if you care about the Jewish community. I just want to express my appreciation to your members who are viewing this for all that the AJC does, and does, by the way, globally. So it's focused on issues here at home and to things that are affecting the Jewish community, quality education. It's focused globally on the spread of anti-Semitism globally. It's as strong and as supportive of Israel as one could want. So on a personal level, before we begin, Jason, I just want to express my appreciation to you and AJC for all that you are doing and will continue to do.
And I would just underline that Senator Coleman's words, right on target. AJC plays such a vital role for the American Jewish community, the world Jewish community. Delighted, and Democratic Majority for Israel is delighted to be co-sponsoring this event with the Republican Jewish Coalition and, of course, with the American Jewish Committee and with Jason. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both so much for your kind words and for your continued partnership with us as we move forward in the best interest of our community. Let me begin with my first question. I'd like to ask both of you the same question. At this point, it does appear that Vice President Biden has won the presidency with a narrow electoral college margin and a more substantial popular vote lead. Meanwhile, President Trump, who said repeatedly during the campaign that the only way that he could lose the election would be by fraud, is challenging the count in several states. So this race is not yet over, but whatever the final outcome, a few things are clear, including the stark divisions in our country and the anger and resentment and frustration that we've seen boiling over in recent months at campaign rallies and also in our city's streets. I'd like to ask each of you to assess those divisions in our country and how each of your party's campaigns sought to respond to them in advancing a vision for America. Let me begin with you, Senator Coleman.
So I actually have a much more optimistic view. We had an election in spite of the greatest pandemic that we've ever faced, and we've had more turnout than we've ever had. Americans showed up and voted. And in spite of the fact that all the polls and all the prognosticators all indicated that Donald J. Trump was going to get blown away. 17-point lead he had in the Washington Post poll in Wisconsin, 10-point lead across the board. This is a very close election. And one of the things that I think it reflected is one that, and I give the president credit for this, that there are a lot of Americans out there who feel that no one's listening to him but him. That there's a kind of a populist sense in a positive way. And we as Jews get worried about populism in the negative sense. But you know, the average guy, the average man and woman. And by the way, the president, look at his numbers. He did you know, much better than any Republican has done among blacks, among Hispanics, among gay lesbians, and then ultimately among Jews. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. New York Times, Florida poll, 43% of Florida Jews voted for Donald J. Trump. So I actually think that this election may be an opportunity to do two things in a positive way. One, I hope the woke left progressives understand that there is a part of this country that is kind of center right. We are divided in half politically, but recognize that they're not all racist and they're not terrible people. They're average Americans who in many ways feel left behind by globalism, feel that, you know, Washington's not speaking or listening to them. And so I think they got up and they voted. It wasn't with arms, and it wasn't unlike what you see on the left with you know, Seattle and Portland and anarchy, et cetera. People voted. And so our challenge is to kind of continue to tap in to that connection that we saw, that enthusiasm we saw for democracy in this race. I'm actually optimistic as to where we stand and the opportunities. And I would hope that whoever then wins this presidential race, and it looks like, you know, Senator Vice President Biden has an easier path, is on his way, that I hope there is then a kind of a reaching out to the other side and to really kind of govern in a unifying fashion. But I was uplifted by this election. I was uplifted by the numbers. I was uplifted by the turnout, and I was uplifted by what I saw, you know, people standing up again, president in places where they simply didn't give him any credit, and responding in a way that gives me at least hope for a better and brighter future.
Thank you, Senator. Mark, how does it look to you?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, we have to recognize that as of this moment, and not all the votes have been counted, not all the votes cast before election day have been counted. But at this moment, more people have voted for Joe Biden than for any other presidential candidate in the history of this republic. Point one. Point two, well, at this moment, as we speak, Joe Biden's essentially at 270 electoral votes. We still have states left to fall one way or the other. And I think when all is said and done, Biden's going to have much more than 270 electoral votes. So the reality is we're going to have a 5 or 6 point margin, which is a meaningful margin, very meaningful margin in presidential politics. Donald Trump got elected president last time with having a minority of the votes cast. This time, Joe Biden's going to have a clear majority of the popular votes cast, as well as a clear majority, overwhelming majority of the electoral votes cast. And we've seen some changes in this election. The reality is there are a number of states that voted narrowly for Trump last time that are voting narrowly, but for Joe Biden this time, whether it's those states in the upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, which I think will be in the Democratic column, but certainly Michigan and Wisconsin, Arizona. We've seen a number of states move. We may see Georgia move. So there has been movement, very clear movement in a Democratic direction in a number of key areas. But I think there has been a difference in the way these campaigns have been run. And I don't want to refight the campaign and sort of trot out the campaign talking points, but I think there is something, a deeper point here, which is if you saw Joe Biden speak yesterday, if you saw him speak on the campaign trail, what you heard was somebody talking about bringing the country together, about healing divisions, about not engaging in divisive kinds of rhetoric, in divisive kinds of actions, but about, again, bringing people together, about healing. President Trump has really governed by division. And that's been an important part of his approach. It's why a lot of Republicans abandoned him, a lot of leading Republicans abandoned him in this electoral quest because they felt he was too divisive. And the reality is the vast majority of Americans do think that he is a divisive figure. So I'm very hopeful with Joe Biden as president that we will have more of a coming together, that we will have more of bringing people together, that we will have more healing being promoted, and that we won't be in the same kind of divisive situations that we had up till now. On the other hand, and I'll just close briefly with this, the reality is we have important forces pulling the two parties apart. And it's not just party leaders, it's not just party insiders. We have a public and a geographically based political system that pulls this country apart. If you are a Republican member of Congress, most often you are not being pulled to the center by that median voter worried about that general election against the Democrat. You're more worried about a primary challenge from the right. And similarly, if you are a Democrat, you are not being pulled to the center by the median voter. You are worried about the primary challenge, in that case, from your left. And so the end result is that's pulling our country apart, makes it much more difficult to engage in the kind of healing, the kind of reconciliation that Joe Biden is preaching.
If I can add one thing, Jason, just one quick response. And by the way, I do agree with the last comment about both of us and both our parties being pulled either from the right or from the left. And in the end, I think this election is an election about the center. And where I would challenge my Democrat friend is that Democrat whole campaign has been based on divisiveness. It's about identity politics. It's, are you black? Are you gay? Are you war? I mean, it's the entire approach has been that way. And if Joe Biden is in fact to prevail, he's going to prevail not because of the identity politics, because he talked about being, Joe from Scranton, and appealed to the folks in the center, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and even in Georgia. So I would say my friends on the left, their entire approach has consistently been identity politics, has been dividing America. And I think in the end, this election was about a much broader center coming together and perhaps now electing Joe Biden, but at the same time, keeping Republican control of the Senate and having Republicans actually picking up House of Representatives seats at a time when they were projected to lose 10 or 20, picking up 5 to 7, and at the same time holding on to state legislatures. And so I see this election being a positive for those of us who kind of moved to the center, but that has not been the approach of my friends on the left.
Well, let me actually follow up on that, because I've got a raft of questions here, but I'd like to stay on this point. It's so interesting and so important. How can we build from this election, therefore, to drive away these forces of polarization in both parties? Is it possible to refocus on the center in a much more determined, deliberate way, sustained way going forward? Mark, let me let you start.
Well, and this is sort of the, if you will, the contradiction in Senator Coleman's argument, which is to say, yes, there are certainly some people in the Democratic Party who are focused on division. There's a president in the Republican Party who is focused on division. The president, as Senator rightly said, the person who ran for president of the Democratic banner with the Democratic nomination, the person who's going to win the presidency as a Democrat, is the person in this race who is trying to bring people together and is working toward the center. So I think that is an important fact and an important leverage point for the future. How do we bring about greater unity? How do we focus more on the center? Joe Biden, I think, is committed to doing that. And I think he made that clear in the campaign. That is the way he ran his campaign. That is the way he, I think, intends to run his administration. And that's the way he's operated in the Senate for all those years. It's really how he operated as the vice president, too, working with the Senate. He talked a lot about being able to make agreements across party lines. He did that when he was in the Senate. He did it as vice president. Those agreements didn't always stick that he made with as vice president. He had that word vice in front of his name then. But now he makes the final decisions. And so I think that is his nature and that is his tendency. But his nature and tendency is going to be challenged by real political forces that exist outside of him and outside of the wishes of any individual person in the country, for that matter, that again is pulling the country in very opposite directions. So we'll have to see how that balances out. But at least we have a president that's committed to bringing people together, rather than a president who feels his political future is secured by stoking division.
Norm, any additional comments?
And again, I'll just put aside that the election's not over yet. But if we're assuming that if Joe Biden comes to president, virtually hasn't pulled people together. We had a Democrat convention in which the streets were aflame in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I'm from, in Portland, in Seattle. And not a word. This is he's the candidate. Not a single word in that entire process. And it only took until I think Poland showed that American people really were concerned about this, did he in fact respond? And I go back, Jason, to Barack Obama. He ran a campaign that seemed to be so unifying. No red America, white America. Just one America, et cetera. And in the end, this country left after his 2 terms in office more divided on race, more divided on wages, rich, poor, gay, straight. I mean, he stoked in the end. He was not a unifying force. Joe Biden had, if Biden is the president, the test will be, can he stand up to those forces on the left? Can he in fact move away from the identity politics? He has in the past. I give him credit for that. I served with him. He's a good man. I disagreed on policy, but that's okay. We can disagree. We both have the same goal. We want every kid to have the opportunity to be the best they can be. But that will be the test. And you didn't see it. There was a silence about the violence. There was a silence about the division in this country until I think almost politically forced to. So the test will be, can you turn that rhetoric that you heard at the end into reality? I hope that's so. I pray that's so. But certainly I didn't see it from Barack Obama. And yes, I didn't see it from Donald Trump. Okay, we didn't see that kind of pulling us all together. I pray, because that is the hope, that in the end, and if Trump would be reelected, my plea to him would be, Mr. President, find a way to bring us together. If Joe Biden is in the White House, Joe, live up to your rhetoric, but don't fall back into what Barack Obama said, and in the end, what Barack Obama did.
I'll just make one point to close this out, which is not only did Joe Biden stand up to those forces on the far left, he actually beat them.
Let's move on. Let's look at the impact of this election, the impact that it will have on a set of issues of long-standing concern to the Jewish community. We've already spent some time talking about divisions within our society, and that's an issue, of course, that's of great concern to any vulnerable minority. But specifically on the issue of assuring continuity in the mutually beneficial U.S.-Israel alliance and advancing peace between Israel and its neighbors, on the issue of confronting the Iranian threat to America's Middle East allies and to global security, on the issue of combating anti-Semitism in this country and abroad, how will the new political configuration in Washington approach those subjects? Let me start this time with you, Mark.
Well, honestly, I don't think it's going to be terribly different, except in a couple of key respects, which is to say, there is no question that Joe Biden has had a very long and very strong commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship. He first visited Israel to meet Golda Meir when he first joined the Senate in 1973, before the Yom Kippur War. He's dealt with every Israeli prime minister since then. He's been steeped in these issues as chairman and ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We've never had a president who knows these issues, who knows the Israel issues better than Joe Biden does. Second, his commitment, I think, is very clear, very strong, and very long. When it comes to two of the specific areas you mentioned, one is the normalization agreements. I think we are going to see, we did see strong support for those normalization agreements. Look, we were in the middle of a presidential campaign. There were few individuals on the Democratic side who came out and said, oh, this is just, it's bad because it's Trump is engaged and involved with these normalization agreements. That's not the position that Joe Biden took. That was not the posture that he struck. Joe Biden put out a series of statements when those normalization agreements were arrived at, praising them for their importance, for the fact that these countries were recognizing Israel's right to exist, talking about how important it was to further these agreements and to expand the range of those agreements. Now, I will tell you, there will be an area of controversy here, potentially. The area of controversy has to do with arms sales. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Joe Biden or on behalf of his campaign or his administration, but there are Democrats who are concerned about selling the most advanced American weaponry to some of these regimes that are now being very friendly to Israel, which is wonderful, and being friendly to the United States, but which may be seen as unstable regimes. And the people who are upset about that, worried about that, are people who remember U.S. troops fighting against U.S. weapons in Afghanistan, who understand that these regimes may or may not be terribly stable. And to the extent they're not stable, they may be great as they are, but if someone else takes over those countries, we may or may not want to be having the most advanced military technology in the world in the hands of their successors. So this is an issue that, again, I don't know where it's going to come out, but there are some Democrats who are certainly concerned about that. But Democrats, almost to a person, with literally a few exceptions, you can count on less than one hand, have praised these agreements overwhelmingly. The second issue is Iran. And I think we're going to see a desire on the part of the Biden administration to get a new and different and better diplomatic agreement with Iran. They may or may not be able to achieve that. They are committed, totally committed to preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but they understand that the only way to do that, not using military means, is through diplomatic agreement. And the reality is we've had 4 years of maximum pressure. You can say it was a good policy. You can say it was a bad policy. I don't argue the merits of it. But what you can also say is that as an empirical fact, Iran today is closer to a nuclear weapon today than it was the day Donald Trump took office, and probably closer than they've ever been to having a nuclear weapon today. So we need an agreement that's going to work. And I think the Biden team and the vice president himself are deeply committed to achieving an agreement that will work. And that means an agreement that is stronger, that is better, that is longer lasting than the agreement that was achieved during the Obama administration. But obviously, and it's going to take pressure, it's going to take sanctions to make that happen on the Iranian side. Obviously requires agreement on the Iranian side. So it's going to be a process to get there.
Mark, on the issue of combating anti-Semitism at home and abroad.
I think there's no question that Joe Biden and his administration will be strongly committed to that goal as well. I think Biden has spoken out over many, many years against anti-Semitism, both here in America and overseas. Again, without getting into the campaign talking points, the reality is Joe Biden got into this race importantly because he saw people marching in Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us. That's why he got into this race. That's not the only thing they were saying. That's not the only thing they were doing. But that's one of the things that they were saying and doing. And it's the important reason he got into this race is to combat exactly those kinds of sentiments.
Understood. Senator?
Yeah, first let's do foreign policy and I'll come to anti-Semitism. First of all, let's state up front that I think it's undeniable that Israel has not had a stronger friend in the White House than Donald J. Trump. If he was running for president of Israel, I think he'd win in a walk. And that's because he moved the embassy to Jerusalem when everyone said it couldn't be done, even though it was American law, by the way, since 1996, 97. I think Joe Lieberman might have been in his first couple of days in the Senate had that passed. But in any case, so he was there, whether it's moving the embassy, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan, whether it's having Nikki Haley in the United Nations, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting anti-Israel actions in the UN in a major way, whether it's tail of force legislation that stopped the using of American taxpayer dollars to pay for killing Israelis, Jews and Americans. And so you had a president there hasn't been a stronger friend. I think, we keep getting back to this, but if you look at the New York Times survey of Jews in Florida and the voting there, 43% voting for Donald Trump. That's kind of double where we started with support for Republicans among Jews going back not too long ago. So an extraordinary number. I think it's a reflection within our community that, particularly on the Israel issue, Donald Trump has stood there. And so the question for Biden is where does he go? He supported the Iran deal. The Iran deal, there's a reason why folks on all sides of the political aisle in Israel said the Iran deal was an existential threat to them. It wasn't just Bibi Netanyahu. And so, you've got that guaranteed Iran a path to a nuclear weapon over a certain period of time. It gave Iran resources to continue its nefarious deeds in the region and the things that they're doing in Gaza, things that they're doing in Lebanon, the things that they're doing in Baghdad. I mean, so it kind of allowed them kind of free reign to keep doing that. And this president said no and put in place the toughest sanctions that have ever been. And Iran today is a lot weaker today, is a lot less capable of destroying Israel and disrupting things in the region than it was when Joe Biden left the White House. So let's see kind of what he does. And if he goes back into another Iran deal, that in the end allows Iran to continue developing its missile capacity, continue to do its nefarious deeds in the region, and ultimately over a certain period of time have an assured path to nuclear weapon, that would be a disaster. That would be an absolute disaster. So I hope that he can come to an understanding. He was wrong about the Iran deal. He was wrong about when President Trump took out al-Soleimani, the Iranian terrorist who was the lead terrorist responsible for the death and wounding of thousands of Americans. He was wrong in not supporting that. I could go, he was wrong, by the way, in not supporting taking out bin Laden. So I hope he gets it right. I hope that there are good folks around him who help him get it right. But the Iran deal will be a major point. And clearly, if we go back to enabling Iran, that would be a disaster for Israel, it would be a disaster for our own security. And on anti-Semitism, this president spoke out, by the way, boldly, in terms of what he did with an executive order, speaking out about anti-Semitism on American campuses, speaking out about anti-Semitism in the UN, and then speaking out in this country. And no matter how many times he condemned white supremacists, the KKK, the tropes are, Trump's not condemning. It was kind of almost laughable if it wasn't sad. But the bottom line is that anti-Semitism is a problem. It's not one Donald Trump created. It's a problem here. And by the way, go to France. I mean, when you go to Tel Aviv, as all of us know, who spend time in Israel, you see more French Jews in the pools around Tel Aviv than you see in France, because anti-Semitism is so bad in Europe. So I think we need a global commitment to doing that. I think this president did a range of things that were laudable and should be applauded. And if Joe Biden is next president of the United States, I hope he continues down that path.
Let me ask you both about the polls that show American Jews supporting Donald Trump, maybe 25 to 30%. It's a little unclear. I know the AJC poll that we conducted and released 2 weeks ago showed that Joe Biden was like 3-1 over Donald Trump in American Jewish voter sentiment. Yesterday, in the polls, in the exit polls that we've seen from Tuesday, that number seems to have gone higher for the president, maybe as high as 30%. And Norm, as you pointed out, in Florida, the exit poll showed 43%. But let me ask, in light of everything that you've just outlined, Senator, the points that the president has made again and again for almost 4 years about Israel, the steps that the administration has taken toward Israel, why isn't that number even higher? Mark, let me begin with you.
Well, first of all, we should be somewhat wary about all these numbers. I say that as a professional pollster. This has not been the shining election for pollsters by and large. So it is odd, I will say, to have all these people out of one side of their mouths criticizing polls and then saying, well, it's 30%, not 27% of the vote. But look, if you look at the polls that have been done of the Jewish community, on average, you see that on average, Trump's getting about 27% of the Jewish vote. That is very close, within a point, 2 or 3 of what other Republicans have gotten in the past. If you look at, again, the weight of these polls, you're looking at Biden at about 75%, 73%, 74%, 75%, somewhere in that neighborhood. Again, these are all very close. And if somebody wants to argue that the point or two is they're sure that it's not that, it's 2 points less, there's really no basis on, or 2 points more, no basis on which to make that argument. So the reality is this election has turned out for the Jewish community like most other recent elections, with Jews overwhelmingly supporting the Democratic candidate. South Florida is different. I'll talk about that in a second. But the reason, I think, is very clear, which is to say American Jews look at both parties as being pro-Israel. They looked at both of these candidates as being pro-Israel, and they were right in looking at both of these candidates as pro-Israel, and they're right in looking at both these parties as pro-Israel. So if you've got that taken care of, if you've met that threshold, then the question comes down to, I would argue, a question of pluralism. The American Jewish community recognizes that what makes America congenial for us, what makes it possible for our community to succeed in this country, is the air of pluralism that infects and affects everything we do in this country. And to the extent that there are groups that are anti-pluralistic in some important way, that is a threat to the standing, it's a threat to our country, but it's also very much a threat to the standing of the American Jewish community within our country. And I think people perceive the Republican Party, some people want to say unfair, some fairly, but perceive the Republican Party, and particularly Donald Trump, as allying with those anti-pluralistic, anti-liberal, small L here, anti-liberal elements in our society. I will say South Florida looks like it's a little different. One of the most dramatic statistics out of this election so far, there may be more, but is Miami-Dade County. The truth is Joe Biden, through the rest of Florida, through North Florida, Central Florida, did better than he needed to do in order to win Florida. Should have won Florida based on those numbers. He didn't win Florida because of South Florida. And the most dramatic example of that is Miami-Dade County. Hillary Clinton won it by 29 points. Joe Biden won it by 7 points. That is one of the most dramatic differences you will find in any major place in a major county in this country. Why did that happen? A lot of reasons. Part of it is the Cuban Latino community, the Latino Venezuelan community there. That's an important part of it. But I would also argue that chances are the Orthodox Jewish community in Miami-Dade County was an important piece of that. We've seen Orthodox Jews, as we've seen religious people from all denominations, religious Catholics, religious Protestants, religious Mormons, becoming increasingly Republican over time. That's true of religious Jews as well, traditionally observant Jews. And we have a disproportionate share of those traditionally observant Jews in Miami-Dade County. So again, there are going to be pockets of difference. We're going to see some places in New York, I would wager, that also move strongly. The word Jewish areas that are Haredi, ultra-Orthodox areas that are going to be strongly against Biden and pro-Trump. But that's not going to represent the Jewish community as a whole, that Orthodox Jewish community, of which I'm a member, but is only represents about 10, 12% of the American Jewish population.
Thank you, Mark. Senator, the 30% or so.
Better respond, but one thing we're going to agree, and I do want to respond to this. One thing that I think we agree on with the polling is that it's substantially underestimated support for Donald Trump. And for a whole range of reasons, what are they called? Maybe social desirability. People actually afraid to say that they're for Donald Trump and be ridiculed for that, being negative implications of saying that publicly. I think that will change after this election. But clearly, if there's one thing we can agree on the polls, that support for President Trump was severely underestimated across the board, and I would maintain in the Jewish community. So, we looked at Trump getting about 30%. I do have to say one thing. As I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, there's a historical piece of this, from my Republican party. When I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I tell people it's not a joke, I never met either a Republican or Lutheran until I went to college. There weren't any. We were Democrats, and then there were Catholics, and the Irish, Italian, and Jews, and whatever. But that was it. And so the challenge is, and Mark, this is where, and we haven't discussed this, but I don't think all Jews look at both parties being equally pro-Israel, and the Democratic Party is not equally pro-Israel today. And the challenge is that there are, put it this way. You go for a rally in front of a Democrat base and you say, I stand for Israel. That is not an applause line. In any Republican gathering of any sort, of any Republicans across the board, that's an applause line. And that's in part because some of the loudest voices in the Democrat Party are the voices of AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and folks that are not pro-Israel. And I would maintain in many ways are anti-Semitic. And those are loud voices in the Democratic Party. And so, Joe Biden, if he becomes the president, the real test is going to be, is that Democratic Party going to somehow, what voices, what are going to be the ascendant voices, particularly in regard to Israel? And so, no, I would not argue that the Democrat Party today is a pro-Israel party. I would urge there be more support in the Democratic Party for Israel. I appreciate everything that Mark does and his team does. But in fact, there are loud voices in that party that are loud voices, almost dominating in terms of energy policy and perhaps in foreign policy, that clearly push the Democratic Party to being more anti-Israel, or certainly more pro-Palestinian. And certainly that should be of concern to all Democrats.
Well, let me expand on this actually and pose questions to both of you on issues of tensions within your respective parties. Mark, first, how will Democrats who mounted a united front to push Joe Biden over the top, so it seems, how will the Democrats handle the division between their moderate and so-called progressive camps on matters relating to Israel and foreign policy generally? Will a Biden foreign policy, assuming Biden goes on to victory, reflect a melding of disparate views within the party? And Norm, how will the Republicans deal with the outrageous and anti-Semitic QAnon conspiracy theory, which has found a home in your party and will now have a proponent, Marjorie Taylor Greene, in Congress? And if Donald Trump leaves the White House, do you see the party adopting a different tone on some of these issues, including confronting white supremacy, which you've already discussed? Mark, let me begin with you.
Sure. Look, there is no question there is a battle in the Democratic Party between pro-Israel and anti-Israel forces. That's why our organization exists, to fight that battle. But there is no question at the same time that we are winning that battle and that the anti-Israel forces are losing that battle. That it is not permanently won. It's not a fight that's over. It's a fight that's going to be a long-term fight. But the reality is loud voices and influential voices are not the same thing. And Senator Coleman is right to say that there are some loud anti-Israel voices in the Democratic Party, but it is absolutely incorrect to suggest that those loud voices are influential on these issues. Can they be influential on other issues? They may well be. Are they influential on these issues? The answer is no. How do we know that? Well, just look at the votes. When we had a resolution before the United States Congress condemning BDS, over 95% of House Democrats voted to condemn BDS. Were there a few people that voted no? Yes. Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, one or two others. They were alone, virtually alone. We had a resolution before the US Congress saying we should make sure that our security commitment to Israel, as outlined in the memorandum of understanding, should be sacrosanct, shouldn't be additional conditions on it. Again, over 95% of the House Democrats voted for it. Were there people against it? Yes. AOC, Tlaib, Omar, a few others, but just a few. You can't be influential if you're losing 95% of the other Democrats. That is the definition of not being influential, not the definition of being influential. There was one person who voted against Turkey sanctions in the entire US Congress. It was Ilhan Omar. How can you say she's influential if she is the person voting alone on the topic? So these people are not very influential. We had a debate on the platform in the Democratic Party. It was a real debate. There were people, there were organizations that call themselves pro-Israel, that were fighting for what I considered an anti-Israel platform. Joe Biden said, no, we're gonna have a pro-Israel platform. We worked hard to make sure that happened. And that's exactly what happened. Those propositions were put before the Democratic Party in convention and were defeated overwhelmingly by Democrats. So the reality is there is a battle, but it's a battle that pro-Israel forces are winning. There is a small anti-Israel contingent. There'll be a couple more members of that contingent in this Congress, but just a couple more. We were engaged in 29 primaries this cycle to help keep those anti-Israel folks out of the Congress. We won 28 of the 29. We lost one. We're sorry we lost it. Believe me, it's an important one. But the reality is that caucus of anti-Israel Democrats is small, and it's only getting a little bit larger.
And my mother of blessed memory would say, Mark, from your lips to God's ears. I just don't know if that's the case. Eliot Engel is no longer going to be, and here's the difference, and we touched upon this very early when we first began, talking about being pulled by forces on the left and the right. And the fact is, so Eliot Engel is not going to be in the U.S. Congress. One of the really strong voices for Israel, worked in a bipartisan man. He's gone. William Lacey Clay, who gets taken out in Missouri by another kind of advocate of the far left. That's who are the loud voices. And if they can take you out in a primary, it gives them inordinate power. And they have that power because they've won some of these races and they show it continuously. So I think that will be a great test. And again, I'm seeing that these are the loud voices, and it's not to compare, Jason, to mention one person who gets elected, who I think, by the way, is disavowed QAnon, compared to the progressive forces where Bernie Sanders is almost their candidate, and to somehow get any kind of equality. QAnon is not an issue in the Republican Party. It doesn't have a voice in the party. It's not waving its head in the party. And you're not seeing people wanting to embrace it. And they're not knocking folks off in primaries, by standing on that platform. So, I think you got to kind of apples and oranges there. But in the end, I think it is being a little disingenuous to discount the strength and the power of the forces of the progressive forces. And it's not just a few folks. It's the progressive forces in college campuses that are, teaching that Israel is an apartheid state. It's the progressive forces around this country with a home in the Democratic Party that are the home of the BDS movement. It's not on my side of the aisle. And we couldn't get a clean vote about anti-Semitism out of the House because, again, concerned about the force of the progressive forces on the left. So I think it is a huge issue. I think it's yet to be resolved. And again, I'm hopeful that everything that Mark said at the very end comes to fruition. If it is, that will make me as a Republican happy because I care about this country. I care about Israel. I'd like it to be supported in a bipartisan way. But clearly, there are major forces in the Democratic Party that are looking and moving in the other direction.
We could go back and forth on this, but let me just move on to one other topic, and then I think we'll open it up to questions from our viewers. How important is the Jewish vote in American politics? I saw that another longtime friend of AJC, Jewish Democratic Council of America Executive Director Haley Soifer, was quoted yesterday as saying that overwhelming Jewish support, as she put it, contributed to the narrowness of the vote in Wisconsin and Michigan and Nevada and Arizona. Were Jewish voters, who constitute 2% of the population, but more of the vote, really significant in this election cycle? And also, why is it that when we distributed a report yesterday, AJC, on the congressional elections and looked at the number of Jews who are going to be serving in Congress beginning in January. It's 6% of the Congress, 9% of the U.S. Senate, 6% of the Congress all told. For a population that's 2% of the larger society, why this disproportionate impact and involvement of Jews in American politics? So on the voting side and on the political involvement side, let me begin with you, Norm.
Because our moms didn't raise dumb kids. we are part of our heart and soul. This is a great question, and it's a longer needs a longer answer than I can give in this session here. But just three things. One, in just on a political sense, in races that are so close with a country that's so divided, even if you're just a couple of percent in the population, you can't be ignored. And so, yes, in that sense, you can have an impact. So it really is important that that's why there's an RJC. It's why there's why Mark's doing what he's doing. Critically important. So we start with that. Second, the fact that we are more engaged, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's in our nature. It's who we are. It's part of our character. It's our whole kind of ethical core to be involved. We're a people of who were enslaved. Liberation is important. To go along and making the world a better place is part of our character. And so we tend to be more engaged, which, by the way, also we've been more engaged in terms of giving financially. That makes a difference. Jews tend to be involved. They don't simply kind of make some money and then move away and hoard and sit on a little island. What they do is they reach out on both sides of the aisle and say, hey, I think your party is more pro-Israel, and that's really important to me, and I'm going to support you. Or I think your party is more, on this education and the school choice, and we're going to support you. And so I think that the divide in America makes any group, including Jews, important. And we are in those states that make a difference: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, not New York and California. That's not going to make a difference, but in those areas. And I think our character, that's my sense, is we are an engaged people. We step up to the plate. We really believe in making this world a better place. And ultimately, the other thing is we do care about the Jewish state. We care about Israel, and that's fundamentally important. And government, by its policies, will impact our brethren in Israel. So I think for those reasons, we fight way above our weight, Jason. We fight way above our weight.
Mark?
I completely agree with everything Senator Coleman said. So that mark this down as a unique moment. But I would just add sort of two small points. One is, in a very close election, everybody makes a difference. That's what it means to be a very close election. When we'll see what the final results are, but we're looking at a race in Georgia that could be decided by literally hundreds of votes, maybe 1,000 votes, maybe 2,000 votes. Everybody mattered. Every person that turned out on both sides made a difference in the outcome of this race. And we have a lot of close races, whether it's in Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada. So there's no question that everybody has the opportunity to make a difference when there are those very close races. Second, with respect to why Jewish involvement, again, I agree with everything Senator Coleman said about the sort of Jewish DNA speaking to the need to be involved and engaged in the wider society. So it's ideology, but it's also interest, which is to say, we understand that as I started to say before, we understand that our security in this country or in any country depends in part on the nature of the political systems in those countries. We've seen what happens. Our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents back to Egypt understands what happens when pharaohs arose that don't know us, when people get into power that aren't favorably disposed to our community. And we know it makes a big difference to us as a people. And so that's another reason, in addition to the ideology, we also have real interest in making sure this government, this polity, tends to continue to be one that is liberal, again, not ideologically, but liberal in the broader sense, and pro-Israel and welcoming to the Jewish community and therefore to other communities as well.
And Jason, for the record, I associate myself with the comments of the gentleman from Washington. Thank you. Everything he said, I agree with.
I very much like the tone that we're ending this stage of our conversation. Thank you, gentlemen, both. Jillian, let's open it up to questions from our viewers.
Thank you, Jason. We're getting several other questions on the Jewish vote, including from Sarah Moskowitz in Chicago, who says, one of the surprises of this election was the diversity of opinion among Latino voters and the realization that the issues Latin Americans care about vary greatly. Can the same be said for American Jewish community at large, and can American Jews, should they still be seen as a single voting bloc?
Well, I would say there are voting block. There's blocks and there's blocks. So, which is to say, we can say that American Jews are a voting block because they vote, roughly 75% for Democrats. That just sort of by one reasonable definition is a block. That doesn't mean there aren't some real differences within that block. As I said, for example, Orthodox Jews tend to be much more Republican than non-Orthodox Jews. And similarly with Latinos, there is a difference between Latinos of Mexican descent or origin and those of Cuban or Venezuelan origin. There are differences between Latinos on the Rio Grande Valley, for example, who are very economically hard pressed and see the virus as a huge economic burden on them, and Latinos elsewhere who are concerned about the health implications of the virus, who live in big cities. So again, there are differences among all these segments. There's no such thing as a 100% unified bloc, except when it comes to partisanship. And even there, 97% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden, 97% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump. And so we can say those are pretty solid blocks. But once you sort of get beyond those purely partisan groupings, there is room for diversity, and there is diversity.
If I may add, one perhaps a little difference from what Mark has articulated, and that is, I think first of all, I agree, there's not blocks, but if for Jews that care, if you look at our polling, it was interesting, for Jews that listed Israel as its number one priority, our poll had 87% for President Trump, 6% for Biden. And of course, we've touted that Israel has never had a better friend in the White House than Donald J. Trump. For folks who were concerned about the pandemic, it was almost 80% for Biden and 14% for Trump. On the economy, Trump won overwhelmingly, again, within our survey. But by the way, lost for those who are concerned about character, folks who simply didn't like Donald Trump and didn't like the way he handles himself and didn't like his tweets. And so there are some differences. And that's one of my great concerns is on the Israel issue, that not enough of our brethren, not enough of the generation care about Israel, care about its safety and security. And so, which is why, I keep saying I'm applauding what Mark Mellman's trying to do, because I worry that if we don't have bipartisan support, we're in trouble. And as you can see, at least by our breakdown, those who cared about Israel overwhelmingly supported the president, those who cared about COVID, overwhelmingly supporting Biden. I'd like to see a lesser division on the Israel issue at some point in the future.
Good. Jillian, another question?
Thank you. The next question is for Mark from Daniel Halberstam in Westchester, who says, if Vice President Biden does assume the presidency, do you think that he and his administration will continue the work of the Trump administration, specifically in working to advance diplomatic and economic relations between Israel and potential Arab partners, and building on the momentum we've been seeing under President Trump?
Yes, as I tried to suggest before, I think there's no doubt that will continue. As I think I mentioned, there are those in the Democratic Party when those normalization agreements came out, a few people who said, boy, Joe, you should be against those because it's a Trump accomplishment in quotes. And he said, no, I think these are great, important agreements. I want to further them. This has been part of in fairness, this is a long-term effort. Israel has had representation in the UAE for over a decade. There have been quiet contacts. It's wonderful that it's emerged in this way, in a public way and in real normalization. But Biden has played some role in that effort over a long period of time. Obviously, Trump played an important role in that as well. But Biden is totally committed to those agreements and is clearly cognizant of the fact that they reorganize the way we approach the Middle East. So you're going to see, no doubt, continued support for those agreements. As I also said before, there may be some hiccups with respect to arms sales. We'll see how that develops.
Jillian, another question?
I applauded the vice president's response to the treaties with the UAE, with Bahrain, and then ultimately Sudan. And there's more in the works. And so, one of the challenges, and again, we'll see how it plays out, is this president did reestablish much closer ties with Israel and with our Gulf allies. And in part, the Iran deal kind of pushed the Gulf allies and Israel kind of aside. Trump comes in, reestablishes that. And even the Saudis are not part of the recognizing of Israel, allowing planes to fly over Saudi airspace to get to Tel Aviv is a huge boon to the Israeli economy. It opens up India, the whole East, to Israel economically. And the real question mark that my concern, just kind of laying it out there, is because Trump was for something I hope we don't get into forces pushing Biden to be against it, to be negative, and that has happened. I think in some way the president is against something because Obama was for it, Obama was against it, because Bush was for it, and I hope we don't see a replay of that again if Joe Biden ultimately secures the presidency.
We'll be very active on that front too, of course, Norm. Julian, next question.
Thank you. The next question is for Senator Coleman from Josh Sack in Seattle, who says, as the results of the election continue to develop, President Trump has questioned the legitimacy of mail-in ballots, and his campaign has filed legal challenges in several states. If former Vice President ultimately wins the election, do you think the president will accept the results, and what would the RJC urge him to do at that point?
Listen, I think if when the election, first, let me step back. The president's concern isn't about all mail-in ballots. It's about mail-in ballots that are coming in and perhaps would have been mailed after the election, day of the election. It's about, I had a conversation with President Bush one time in the White House, where he said to me his biggest fear was that the other side is just going to keep counting till they won. The president is looking for, he has legitimate concerns about the integrity of the process. He's able to raise those. There are forums to handle that. And it's with mail-in ballots, we all have, mail-in ballots, but in the end, the mail-in ballots in which signatures aren't checked, mail-in ballots in which it's not clear what, when they came in, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a process for handling those. And I have no doubt when that process plays itself out, that we will have what we always have in America, is a smooth transition of power. But I think the president is right. And listen, I was involved in an election that took 9 months to be resolved. I had 19 precincts with more votes than voters. And we had ballots that weren't counted on election day that had different standards for being counted. In the end, I moved on. But there's a process for handling that. We'll follow that process here. But he has every right to do everything that he can to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the process, and where he thinks it's being undermined, to raise concerns about that. But ultimately, I have no doubt that we will have in this country, as always, a smooth transition of power.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that background. And I think we can take one more question before I turn it back to you, Jason, to close us out with final remarks. This comes from Andy Gluck in Denver for both Mark and Senator Coleman. He says, in this incredibly polarized time, what is there to be hopeful about for our country?
Who wants to start with that one? Mark?
Well, there is a lot to be hopeful about. There's a lot to be worried about too, but there is a lot to be hopeful about, which is to say we're still here, we're still functioning. We just had an election that was very divisive. At the end of the day, I think by and large, these frivolous lawsuits are being dismissed by the courts. That system is working properly. I think at the end of the day, Senator Coleman is right. When he loses, which I think is inevitable at this point, Donald Trump is going to leave the White House. He's not going to barricade himself in and call the tanks to keep him there. And that puts us as in a very different place than many, many other countries in the world. And we just have to recognize that fact. That is different. I would argue that we have had movement in an authoritarian direction. I worry about that as a Trump policy, but there is no question that we are still light years different, light years ahead of many other countries where the tanks would be in the streets instead of the lawyers. So that's an important fact. And second, I would say, I'll be honest, my feeling about this, I think the fact that the majority of American voters have repudiated the policies of this administration and the ethos of this administration is a positive, speaks positively about America. I looked at this administration, obviously in a very negative way, not just as a reflexive partisan, but also as somebody who's concerned about democracy, who's concerned about, again, small L liberal values, who's concerned about anti-authoritarianism. I looked at this as a very dangerous administration. And I think the risks of a second term were great. And the fact that the largest number of voters in history, of the history of this country, have agreed with that, to me is a hopeful sign.
Mark, thank you. Senator.
Yes. So listen, I think we have to be concerned about, the bitter partisan divide, the kind of inability to find common ground, even in trying to get, a COVID bill passed before the election. I think we got to be careful about, the majority of Americans, said this, and somehow you disregard the fact that about 49.5 or 9%, whatever it is, has another perspective. And that's always been the concern. One of the great things that came out of this election, if it holds as is, and you have Democrats having the House, keeping the House with a diminished majority, the Republicans holding the Senate, and if Biden's in the White House, is you're not going to have the capacity for that 51% to crush the 49% with things such as packing the Supreme Court, which has been espoused by AOC and by others, including Obama. You have adding perhaps a couple more liberal Democrat senators, making DC a state, perhaps giving the right, changing the electoral process by enfranchising 15 million, 20 million people who are not here legally and saying, okay, all of a sudden, you're now part of the electoral process. I think that would have ripped this country apart. If the 51% put their foot on the neck of the 49%, this country's in trouble. It didn't happen. And so in the end, I think we have a moment of opportunity here. We had the highest turnout that we've ever had, and that's a good thing. People are engaged. We have some narrow majorities, but it's a split in which, as I said before, Republicans increase their presence in the House, increase or control state legislatures, control the Senate, and the Democrats may control the presidency in the House. And perhaps this is where, I pray that we appeal to our better angels, that this president does in fact govern as he has spoken about at the end of this campaign, in a way that pulls people together, and that our friends on both sides of the aisle realize that, these are challenging times, facing a COVID crisis that we have pandemic that we have never kind of experienced before. And so I'm optimistic, Jason, about where we're at. I think we had a tough election, but in the end, we resolved it by ballots, not bullets. I think we've got some division now in government that maybe will require people to reach across the aisle and talk and work together. And I just hope we don't go down that road of separation. I hope we don't go down that road of identity politics. I hope we figure out a way to actually come together, Americans. I think there's a great opportunity for that to happen. And I am just by nature an optimist, and I think the best is yet to come.
Senator, thank you. I'm closing the discussion, but I'd like to ask, if I could, a question that I'm going to ask you to respond to in 20 seconds, each of you, which is, with a divided Congress and a presidency that may shift to the Democrats, can there be progress? Can there be legislative progress in the next 2 years in that situation? We've had this in the past, but do you see that going forward? Can we actually solve some of the country's problems in the next 2 years, given this divided Washington power structure? Senator, first you, just quickly.
Yeah, the answer is, of course we can, if people are willing to not play to the extreme base, but kind of look to the center and say, America's got problems, we've got elected to solve them, let's solve them. Not that complicated. But the question is, will you go down that path?
Mark?
Not that complicated, but hard. And it's hard because our system was built to not do things. We have more veto points in the American system of government than any other government in the world. And that has served us in good stead for most of our history. But we do have serious problems that need to be solved. And we have a system that was put in place to make it extremely difficult to get things done. And that's the system that we're living with. So there's a tension between the desire to get things done, the goodwill and the centripetal forces of politics, and a system designed to prevent things from getting done.
And there we are. Mark Mellman, Senator Norm Coleman, thank you very much for being on this AJC Advocacy Anywhere webinar. And now I'll turn it back to you, Jillian.
Jason, thank you. And again, our thanks to the AJC for giving us this opportunity. Most important, for all the great work that you continue to do.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's always good partnering with you. Jillian.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Coleman and Mark, for this extremely timely conversation. And AJC, the Democratic Majority for Israel, and the Republican Jewish Coalition would also like to thank our global audience for joining us today. You can learn more about our organizations by visiting ajc.org, DemMajorityForIsrael.org, and rjchq.org. Thank you and goodbye.